Hello everybody, this is Professor Mitchell coming to you live with a new lecture about autism and the autistic spectrum. What we're going to cover today is just a very brief introduction to autism. We're going to be looking at the change that has happened from DSM-4-TR to DSM-5 and the integration of PDD-NOS as well as Asperger's into the autistic spectrum. And we're going to look at some of the basic symptoms and basic behavioral patterns that we see with somebody with autism. So I want to begin by just looking at the what is going on with an individual with autism, and we will do that by exploring the basic symptoms that that come about with autism. Hello everybody and welcome to today's lecture. My name is Professor Bradley Mitchell, and today we're going to be talking about autism and the autistic spectrum and the disorders that fall underneath this umbrella. So today I'm going to really focus in on some of the changes that occurred between the DSM-4-TR and the DSM-5, where we took a lot of the psychiatric disorders that were commonly known as the autistic spectrum disorders and basically brought them in and put them into one category. So instead of having multiple categories for autism, now we just have autism as a whole. Now, many of you probably are familiar with some of the older diagnoses, such as Asperger's or PDD-NOS, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder, not otherwise specified. Those individuals didn't go away, but instead they got wrapped up into the diagnosis of autism or the autistic spectrum. So as we look at things going forward, there's going to still be levels of autism. There's still going to be individuals who have high-functioning autism versus lower-functioning autism, but the category is going to be slightly different as we don't have the traditional Asperger's diagnosis any longer. So let's take a look at what it means to have autism and what a person with autism basically goes through on a daily basis. So let me go ahead and transition to the first screen here. And we can see that one of the major symptoms for autism is impaired communication and social interaction. We see this at a very young age. As little as 6 months, we can start to see that there is an impaired social interaction and social communication. There's limited eye contact with mom or caregiver or dad or brothers and sisters. And while communication at 6 months may not be great with expressive communication, we see a deficit in as little as 4 to 6 months where they're not requesting verbally what they may need or what they may want. Every year, we're seeing about 200,000 new cases of autism, and there's a lot of debate as to what's actually going on there. Whether we're actually seeing more autism or if we are seeing a better diagnostic criteria that is being used. Either way, we're seeing more individuals in the United States being diagnosed with autism. This is what we call a chronic neurological disorder. And what that means is, at this point, we do not foresee autism being cured. Now, there's a lot of political discussion when it comes to Cure Autism Now and Autism Speaks. A lot of people don't think that it's something that needs to be cured. And even that term cure in abnormal psychology and psychopathology is a bit misleading because if you recall from previous discussions about other diagnoses, we don't really cure anything. We're in the business of symptom reduction. If somebody has depression, we want to reduce the symptoms of depression so the person is no longer manifesting the dysfunction. With autism, the dysfunction is probably going to be there for the lifetime of the individual, but through proper training and proper therapeutic interventions like applied behavioral analysis, that individual can have a much higher functioning level than they would without any type of intervention. This does require a medical diagnosis that's going to come from a psychologist or a neurological pediatrician or maybe a psychiatrist, but it's not something that somebody will just look at and say, yes, this is definitely autism. There are some specific tests that must be administered for a valid diagnosis to occur. However, there's really no lab tests that are going to give any indication as to whether or not an individual has autism or not. There are starting to be some correlational pieces in genetics that could indicate that an individual may have a predisposition towards autism, but again, there's no blood work, there's no chromosomal test that we can administer to say definitively whether a person has autism or will have autism if it's done in utero. So let's look at what the autistic spectrum actually is, because it's not simply just one thing, it's a lot of things. So within the autistic spectrum, we have a lot of different diagnoses that kind of fit within the mold of autism. And this is where we have to throw that psychological term in of comorbidity. Comorbidity means that two diagnoses exist at the same time, but they don't explain one another. And this gets really tricky in autism because we see, look at the top two, ADD, ODD, ADHD, and then down at the bottom, OCD. These are all psychological or psychiatric disorders that are actually a fundamental part of the autistic spectrum disorder. However, we tend to see a lot of people with autism who actually have a diagnosis of ADHD or ODD. And the reason is not because each of these diagnoses are valid in and of themselves. Quite the contrary, if you have ODD, if you have ADHD, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have autism, but if you have autism, that really kind of necessarily means that you do have ADHD or ODD. So what's going on here? Why do we not differentiate these things? Well, because essentially, the only reason to have that secondary or tertiary diagnosis with autism is because we absolutely need some form of medication for some individuals to increase their functioning level. And unfortunately, there's nothing that's FDA approved to actually treat autism directly. What we have are some pretty significant symptoms that can be reduced and can really be maintained rather well by treating ADHD, ODD, OCD, ADD, by treating those specific symptoms. And they are symptoms of autism, but more specifically, they're just a symptom. They're not a separate diagnosis in and of itself. So why do we see those diagnosed at the same time when technically they're just comorbid, or they're actually not comorbid, they should be mutually exclusive? It's because of the need for medication management. So let's look here at what is going on in the brain, or when we're seeing development, what might be some warning signs, some early warning signs that an individual may be experiencing or may later in life be developing autism. And some of those big indicators are lack of eye contact, lack of gaze where they will follow somebody, lack of wanting to be touched, kind of not engaging in play with other individuals and not engaging in symbolic play. These are all things that may be occurring with autism. And it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who doesn't do these things at a specific time has autism, but these are some of the big indicators for us that tell us that this may be something that the individual may need to look into, or the family may need to look into at a later time. So what does the brain of the individual with autism look like? Well, there are some significant differences. We do know that the cerebral cortex, or the outer layer of the brain, the thing that we actually see is slightly different in individuals with autism. We also know that the amygdala is slightly different. Remember, the amygdala is the fight or flight piece, the thing that activates the sympathetic nervous system. And because that is responsible for emotion and especially aggressive responses, there is a significant difference in the individual with autism. Another thing is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, interestingly enough, is the thin band of nerves that connect the left and right hemisphere. And there is a significant difference with individuals with autism in the size and the abilities of that corpus callosum. And an interesting side note, one of the very first famous or infamous people that really brought autism to the forefront was a gentleman by the name of Kim Peek. You may not know Kim explicitly, but you might know who portrayed Kim in a film. He was portrayed by Dustin Hoffman in the movie Rain Man. And in that movie, they really portrayed Raymond as an individual with autism, but what's interesting is Kim, while he did exhibit a lot of the autistic symptoms, when they did an MRI on him, they found that he had a neurological disorder called agenesis of the corpus callosum. Agenesis, A meaning no, genesis meaning beginning, no beginning of the corpus callosum. While Kim was developing, he never developed a corpus callosum, which allowed his left and right hemispheres to develop kind of independent of each other. And there was very limited connections between the left and right hemisphere, which allowed him to have some amazing abilities. Like he could read a textbook with his right eye reading the right page, the left eye reading the left page, and he could read them simultaneously, and he can encode that information where he could look at a textbook, and within 10 to 20 minutes, he could have a retention of that entire textbook of upwards of 95%, which is amazing, but he also had some significant difficulties, including the fact that, he had all the major symptoms of autism, where he wasn't able to communicate effectively, he didn't have social reciprocation of emotions. It was very robotic in the way that he communicated with people. He was very well conditioned by his family. He and his father went around the country after Rain Man and did interviews and met with people, and he appeared on a very short time to be very functional, but you started to see after watching him for a little while that he was using some memorized scripts that made him appear to be engaging when he wasn't really engaging with people the way that a neurotypical person would. So a lot of these things are incredibly interesting, but in all, what we have to look at here is what does it mean for an individual to have autism? And the short answer is that it means different things for different people. Not everybody is going to look the same with the diagnosis of autism, and not everybody is going to have the same limitations or excesses. What we do know is that individuals with autism can flourish. People with higher functioning autism can do wonderful in high school and college. There's a little bit of a misrepresentation, as with everything in pop culture. There have been some recent movies and some recent television shows that I'm not going to call out specifically that have indicated that individuals with Asperger, what we used to call Asperger's or high-functioning autism, are somehow superhuman in their abilities, that they have otherworldly abilities to perceive things and to think through difficult problems. And while they do think differently, it doesn't give them a superhuman ability. It basically gives them the ability to concentrate much more specifically. So I don't want people to look at people with autism and think, well, they're either severely handicapped or severely gifted. That does happen, but it's just like any other standard distribution. A majority of people with autism kind of fall in the middle, where they have some excesses and some deficiencies. And it's those excesses that we have to build on to help them do better in daily life. And the deficiencies, we can hopefully pull them back up and help the individual. So, I want to thank you for paying attention for this brief introduction to autism. Please feel free to contact me anytime via email or through Twitter, and I hope to be talking to you very soon about another psychological issue, another psychological topic, another lecture on the great field of psychology. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great day.